This current format sucks. Cash Tira is awful for the game. I don't know what to play. Everything is terrible. A lot of things you hear about this current format. I'm here to talk about it. And with that, welcome to another video on the channel. My name is Josh, and I'm bringing you a little bit of a discussion today outside of my usual content that I prepare on stream. I'm filming this one off stream just to give you guys my opinion on what I feel like very relevant topic currently in the community, and that is the current format. Just a little bit of a discussion. If you like that type of content, make sure you let me know in the comments down below so I can do this more often. If you're not subscribed to the channel yet, make sure you do, because that helps a ton. It would mean a lot to me. Without further ado, let's get into some metagame discussion for the current metagame. And let me start by prefacing that I think it is absolutely fine to have different opinions on any given metagame depending on how you enjoy Yu-Gi-Oh! Because that is very different from person to person. Like, some people really like to play the game super competitively. Some people really like to take the game more casually and like to have a lot of fun with whatever they play currently and don't really care about, like, you know, tryharding as much. And that's completely okay. So once again, if you have different views on this topic, feel free to discuss in the comments down below. Please do, but stay nice, all right? But keep it nice. Please be aware of the fact that, like, other people might not share your opinion simply because they play Yu-Gi-Oh! In different ways, and that is, you know, part of the beauty of the game, the fact that you can, like, enjoy it in various different ways. And I think that is something that we should not fight over. But I think very often in these types of things, you can just agree to disagree. Anyways, why do people criticize the current format? I feel like you can narrow it down to 2 to 3 main points. Some of them are really, like, basically, you could really make a basic debate about what makes a good format in Yu-Gi-Oh! Let me know if you want, like, a more generic video about that topic, because I think I could say a few things about that. For this, let's keep it just for this format, where the main criticisms of the current format are: A, the decks that are being played are not super healthy, which is like mainly Cash Tira with the zone locking, and I think Branded with Gimmick Puppet Nightmare, and Labyrinth with Skilled Rain and whatnot. People are not really fond of the top decks. The second criticism, or B, that I hear a lot is that there's just too many different things in the format to prepare for right now. Like, too many decks are viable, I don't know what to expect, and so I can't properly prepare for a tournament. And then C, which kind of ties in with B, is the fact that a lot of good players don't know what to bring because just nothing feels great. There's no clear best deck, right? So let's talk about these one by one, because I do think they are all kind of valid criticism of the current format. Some of them are more true than others. I want to just, like, highlight some of the things that I think are bad about this format, and some are good, because that's usually the case. You'll very rarely have a format that's, like, good in every single aspect, you know, and the current format is no exception to that. There's a few things about the current format that I like, and there's a few things that I dislike. First things first, Cash Tira, Branded being kind of like non-fun strategies, specifically Cash Tira. I think that's true to an extent, because I do think that Cash Tira is a deck that can be super annoying to play against, super oppressive, because it, like, locks your zones, banishes stuff from your extra deck, can banish key cards from the top of your deck face down, so you have no way of getting them back. I'm not a huge fan of Cash Tira card design, but I will say the following thing. I do think, in a way, people are exaggerating about the way that, like, they treat Cash Tira, because I do think that at the end of the day, does it really matter how you lose your games? Because, I mean, yes, there is a full Cash Tira zone lock that locks all your back row, but that is a 3-card combo and only works if it goes uninterrupted, because there's countless ways to answer that 3-card combo. You know, Nibiru, Lava Golem, Kaiju, Sphere Mode, hand traps in general, Lancia. There's a bunch of cards that stop the full zone lock combo. And so my argument here is that if your opponent is pulling off a 3-card combo with a meta deck and goes completely uninterrupted, not met by any counter card, they probably are okay to win the game, right? I mean, that's always been the case, I feel like, in Yu-Gi-Oh!, at least in the recent 10 years or something. If you pulled off a combo consisting of 3 specific cards and your opponent had no answer, yeah, you won the game. I mean, that's always been the case. Does it matter how exactly they win the game now? Because, like, I don't know. I mean, of course, I can understand, like, the fact that zone locking locks you out of some potential answers, right? You're like, okay, well, I had an answer to Cash Tira, but it was Book of Eclipse, and they zone locked me. Well, then maybe you shouldn't be playing that Book of Eclipse right now if that 3-card combo is something super popular and something that people go for. I don't really agree with that, like, the zone lock is a huge problem. I'm more of the opinion that, like, the fact that Cash Tira auto wins the game sometimes if it remains unchecked is something that I understand why it feels bad, but at the end of the day, if anything goes unchecked in Yu-Gi-Oh, it usually wins the game, right? I think if you make that clear to yourself, then it doesn't sound half as bad if you think about it that way, I feel like. But of course, this whole mentality of like, oh, but you have to draw the out to win is still valid. I think it's still a valid point. I just don't think it invalidates the entire format as a whole, that Kashtira has some percentage of games where it just auto wins. I don't think that makes the format terrible. It's annoying, but it is something that you just have to deal with in deck building, and that's always the case. You always have to account for what the top decks are doing with your tech card choices in your decks, and that's like, you know, if the top decks are locking all your back row zones semi-consistently, why are you relying on Book of Eclipses and Book of Moons right now? I mean, like, it's a matter of evaluating meta developments where if people are going for the full zone lock, you need to be prepared for that in the form of, like, you know, kaijus, Nibiru's, Kurikaras, sphere modes, hand traps. But then people can play around that by making an Arise Heart with just 3 materials and playing around Nibiru, Lava Golem, yada yada yada. So you also need to be prepared for that. So you always need to kind of keep an eye on what the trend is in the metagame and make your deck choices accordingly, which I think can be a good thing. But it can also be overwhelming because, like, you're like, hey, but like, I thought Book of Eclipse was super good in this format against Kashtira, but now all of a sudden I'm not supposed to play the card anymore. And then what if my opponent plays around the Nibiru and I sit there with a dead Nibiru in hand? I can understand why that can be confusing in deck building. I do think that is an upside and a downside at the same time. The fact that you have to really stay on point with your tech choices because the meta is ever changing in the decisions that people make, right? But there's that. For branded, honestly, the Gimme Puppet lock is something that I think is less of a concern because that's not a main deck thing. And like, ever since the beginning of time, I mean, like, at least in the recent years, everyone and their mom has been trying to floodgate people when they went first. So I guess having to have one more answer to just another floodgate in your side deck it doesn't feel awesome, but it is what it is. I mean, all the cards you are siding for branded should just help you with the expulsion lock. So it should come down to I need to see side deck to beat branded, which is not ideal. But unfortunately, that's what we have to deal with as long as Gimmick Puppet Nightmare branded expulsion is a thing. I don't love that either. That is a definite critique point that I do not like. Let's talk about format diversity, which was the second thing that was brought up. There's been a lot of comparisons of this format to last year's national format. Just as an example here, Christian Urena, on my way to Peru for the YCS, feels so much like Nationals vibe when it comes to decks and deck building. What he's referring to here is last year's national format. This is the Septo spreadsheet of last year's nationals, or at least this is the week of German nationals, Italian nationals, and UK nationals, and this is all the decks compiled into one spreadsheet. And as you can see, the freaking matchup spread or the deck spread literally looks like a roulette table, and that's what it felt like last format. And let me tell you, from a competitive perspective, which is always my perspective, right? From a competitive perspective, a format that is this diverse is really not great. I understand why some people like this because they feel like they have a lot of different choices and they have a very cool tournament experience playing against a lot of different decks. But from a competitive standpoint, having to prepare for a tournament kind of requires knowing what to expect. And last year at German Nationals, I played only one deck twice. Everything else I only played one random copy of in Swiss, right? The only deck I played twice was Sword Soul. It was really not fun to have like no way of properly preparing for a tournament. And that's, I think, a very valid critique point in general for formats that have just no certain one or two best decks. However, for the current format, I really don't think it is that bad just yet. It might develop in a different way, but as of right now, I'm really looking at it from a perspective where I'm expecting Kashtira, I'm expecting Branded, I'm expecting some Labyrinth, maybe some Sprites, and then one or two Rogue decks if I'm looking at like 12 rounds at YCS London, which is in a couple weeks, which is what I'm currently preparing for. We're gonna have 12 rounds of Swiss. I can realistically expect to face probably around 3 to 4, maybe 5 Kashtira. Also like 3 to 4 Despias, maybe 2 Labyrinths, and then like 1 to 2 Sprites, maybe 1 to 2 Rogues in 12 rounds. I think that's reasonable. I don't think that's too bad. It's not super narrow like, you know, Ishizu tier format was, or Sprite and tier, where basically the only 2 decks before that. Like, it's not that narrow, not that predictable, but I still think it's okay. I think that's something that as a deck builder, I do appreciate the current format a lot more than the previous format, which is, I feel like we went from one extreme to another little bit of an extreme, because last format we had only Ishizu tier. So you knew exactly what to expect, which was a good thing. But then from a deck builder perspective, the problem was there really was no deck building last format. And that is really something that I can really appreciate for this format, which is something that I also encourage you guys to do, is like I always try to look for the positives rather than the negatives. One thing that I really appreciate for this current format is I feel like there's a lot to be done in deck building. I already referred to it earlier when I talked about the Kashtira meta developments, where you have to be on point with your tech choices because of not only the decks that people are playing, but also the plays that people are going for with Kashtira really differ on what everyone perceives to be popular, right? If people perceive Nibiru to be popular, people will play around it by making an Arise Heart with just 3 summons. If people perceive the books to be popular, they might be inclined to include Forbidden Lands in their deck, or go for the full back row zone lock. And so observing the metagame and making your tech choices accordingly is usually something that I really enjoy, because it just tends to be something that I'm relatively good at, because I spend a lot of time in contact with the game, right? A good example of this would be observing the meta trend of everyone only having exactly 1 Mystic Mine out in their deck last year at European Championships, and then making the discovery of like Beat Cop Mystic Mine and really taking advantage of that. Of course, Mystic Mine itself doesn't make for very interactive games, but being able to make that decision in deck building, in my opinion, was a really cool part of that format, even though the gameplay wasn't the best. But the deck building is also part of it, and deck building being rewarded is a good thing, in my opinion. So there's really multiple components to what makes a format enjoyable for me, and while the gameplay portion of a format can be quite poor sometimes, the deck building can still be good and can still be rewarding, which is what I'm trying to focus on in these formats. And like last format in Ishizu tier, deck building was not very rewarding, because you were much better off just sticking to Ishizu tier and just learning how to play the mirror match. The mirror match was fine, but I didn't enjoy the fact that I couldn't really innovate on deck building as much as I would like to, maybe. And so for this current format, maybe the gameplay isn't the greatest when you're zone locked and you don't have to correct out for it, or if you're like, if you have a Nibiru in hand and they go for the 3 material Arise Sword, or if you get Gimme Puppet locked, or if they just have a Branded Fusion and you don't draw the Ash Blossom, or if you're playing Branded and you're being dimensional barriered, the gameplay might not be the best Yu-Gi-Oh's ever been, but I think deck building is more important than in other formats. I can appreciate the format for that, right? I can appreciate it for that. I can try to focus on that in my YCS London preparation, and that is something that I plan on doing, and I plan to enjoy that, and maybe I can find an edge and come up with a good solution that way. And that's really what it comes down to, is like I think appreciating the formats for what is good in them, instead of like always pointing out the negatives. I mean, it is definitely valid criticism in this format. Like, I don't think Kashtira has the most, intriguing play patterns. Like, it's a relatively straightforward deck. I really hate the fact that Despia, while it is usually a very cool and skillful deck, Despia really invokes this like Ash Blossom, D-Barrier, anti-spell kind of mechanic where people really try to hard counter the deck completely, and that makes it unfun to play, especially after siding for me as well. But in these times, when there is valid criticism for the gameplay portion of the game, I do like to focus on deck building personally, which is kind of my personal copium in these sort of times. Because I just look at the last format where it was the complete opposite. You could basically only play Ishizu tier with a relatively standard list. The gameplay was great, but now at least we get to do a little bit more in deck building. And I like that. I do like that. I think that is a definite positive of the format. While I do think a lot of people's criticism of this format is valid, I think it is still overall a format that at this point in time, I am okay with it. I am currently, this is me personally, I am looking forward to YCS London. I think it's going to be a good time. I'm not done with my preparations yet, but I do think that I will be able to find something for the YCS that I will be happy with personally. And at the end of the day, that is all that matters. If I can find a deck that I'm happy with and look forward to an event, I'm happy. And that's my take on the current format. Valid criticism, but also very often people leave out the positives, which I think helps to remind yourself sometimes that there is certain things that are good in the current format. That is it for the little discussion. If you enjoyed me just rambling about the current state of the game for a bit, let me know down below. Once again, like I said in the intro, I do need to know if you guys like this content. So if you do, please show the support by all the stuff. You know what to do. And I'll see you guys either on the next streams. Check out the link in the description down below, or on the next video. Without further ado, hope you have a great rest of your day. Hope you enjoyed watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.